Let's move on to permissions in SharePoint. It's not just no access, read-only, or full access. There are 33 individual permissions that we can assign. They're basically organized into 3 different categories: list permissions, site permissions, and personal permissions. We go over these in detail in the admin sections because admins are the ones that actually work with permissions. But just for your information, an example of a list permission would be, can you approve content? Or can you delete versions? An example of a site permission would be, can you manage permissions on the site? And an example of a personal permission would be, can you create your own personal views within lists and libraries? So there's 33 of these individual permissions, kind of organized into 3 different groups or categories. These individual permissions can be configured into something called a permission level. SharePoint comes with them. Users, owners, and visitors are the defaults. Others can also be created by admins who have permissions to work with permissions. The permission levels are what are applied to the SharePoint groups. Now, the last bit or piece that we need to talk about is something called a securable object. Now, think about it here. We have groups of people, we have permission levels, and now we have the objects that can be secured in SharePoint. Groups and their associated permissions are applied to various different elements in SharePoint, and they can really be any one of the elements: a top-level site, a sub-site, lists and libraries. You can apply them to folders in lists and libraries, or even to individual items, although we don't recommend that because, again, that's kind of micromanaging. But any one of the objects in SharePoint technically can have permissions applied to them. Permissions are inherited, so any content below a certain level inherits the permissions of the level above it. A very simple example is, if I said at my top level site, everybody in my organization had full control, then everybody in the organization would have full control from the top level site through all of its subsites, all of its lists and libraries, all of the folders in those lists and libraries, all the way down to all of the individual items in those lists and libraries. The permission that's applied at the very top would filter all the way down. That is, unless you break permissions. Let's say that the opposite is true, that I've completely tightened down my site, that at the top level, people only have read permissions. Well, that would be true then for the top level site and maybe down through a subsite. But maybe when we get to a list or library, I say, you know what? I think everybody in the company should have full permissions there. I can break the inheritance at that point, and then everything from that list and library down, which means in the list and library, would have the new permissions. So it really works very well. Just think of it as flowing from the top down, and it will continue to be inherited unless you break it and do something different. So who can break permissions or who can change them? Generally, anybody with the name administrator after it. The SharePoint administrators don't usually do a lot of this because they're worried about using the server. These are the IT people, but they can do it. You will often have someone called a site collection administrator or an SCA. They administer all of the sites underneath a top-level site. Each of those sites or subsites has its own site owner, and you could potentially have a list or library owner as well. Those are the main basic categories of people that we have that function as administrators. But remember, we can make permission levels using those 33 levels of permissions. So in theory, a custom permission level could be granted that would give somebody just the ability to work with permissions. That would be a very specific and unique permission level, but it's possible. And don't forget, you control permissions in your own My Site. You are the site owner or the SCA of that site. So see, it's really not that difficult. Permissions in SharePoint are very similar to what they are on the LAN. Almost identical, really, although I get in trouble for saying that by people who are network people. But you get the idea here. We're trying to keep it simple. As a user, you may or may not ever really have to work with permissions, but you now understand how they work. If you do have the capabilities to work with permissions, you now know a little bit more. You probably need a little bit more mentoring before you get to work with them. But what you now know is that permissions are an important part of SharePoint because information needs to be secured for internal and external purposes. SharePoint permissions are similar to traditional network security. We have 33 wonderful site, list, and personal permissions to choose from that can be configured into permission levels. Permission levels are assigned to groups, people are added to groups, and groups are assigned to sites, lists, libraries, folders, and/or items. Permissions are inherited through the SharePoint structure until inheritance is broken, and if it's broken and changed in some way, the new permissions are then inherited from that point down. Permissions can only be changed by administrators or people who have been given permissions to work with permissions. And don't forget one of my favorite sayings in SharePoint: if you can't see it, you're either in the wrong place or you don't have permissions to see it. And then you know how to address the issue.